There's a photograph of Stewart Granger sitting alone in a Beverly Hills restaurant. No crowds, no applause, no glamour. Just a man who once had everything: fame, fortune, adventure, and the love of one of Hollywood's most beautiful women. So how did a star who conquered the world end up facing the final chapter of his life alone? One. The man before the legend. But long before the empty restaurant table, before the loneliness, the regrets, and the quiet reflections of old age, Stewart Granger was a man who seemed destined for greatness. He entered the world on May 6, 1913, in one of London's most respectable neighborhoods. Born James LaBlache Stewart, he inherited more than a distinguished name. His family carried echoes of history itself. His great-grandfather, Luigi LaBlache, had been one of Europe's most celebrated opera singers, a man whose voice was powerful enough to be remembered long after the final note faded. Performance, it seemed, was already woven into the family bloodline. Yet nothing about young James suggested an ordinary future. Tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome, he possessed the kind of presence that could silence a room without a single word. People noticed him, not because he demanded attention, but because attention seemed to follow him naturally. There are certain individuals who enter a space and somehow alter its atmosphere. Stewart Granger was one of them. After studying at the prestigious Webber Douglas School of Dramatic Art, he stepped onto the London stage during the turbulent years of the 1930s. Europe was drifting toward war. The world felt uncertain. But in the darkness of theaters, audiences still searched for heroes, men who looked fearless, confident, and capable of restoring order to a chaotic world. Granger fit that image perfectly. There was only one problem. The name James Stewart already belonged to another rising actor across the Atlantic, a young American who would soon become one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. Two James Stewarts could not exist in the same industry. So James Stewart disappeared. In his place emerged Stewart Granger. It was more than a stage name. It was the birth of a legend. The new name carried weight. It sounded adventurous, dangerous, like someone who belonged on horseback crossing distant horizons rather than standing under theater lights. And audiences responded immediately. By the early 1940s, Granger had become one of Britain's fastest rising stars. Films like The Man in Grey and Fanny by Gaslight transformed him into a national sensation. At a time when bombs fell across Europe and uncertainty haunted everyday life, Stewart Granger represented something people desperately needed: escape. But beneath the charm, the confidence, and the growing fame, another force was already shaping his destiny. A restless hunger. The feeling that whatever he had achieved was never quite enough. And that hunger would soon carry him far beyond Britain to Hollywood, to international superstardom, and ultimately toward the choices that would define both his triumphs and his heartbreaks for the rest of his life. The love that changed everything. That restless hunger eventually led Stewart Granger exactly where he wanted to go. To bigger stages, bigger audiences, and a future that seemed limitless. But fate has a habit of disguising its greatest turning points as ordinary days. For Stewart Granger, that day arrived in 1949 on the set of a modest British film called Adam and Evelyn. That was where he met Jean Simmons. She was only 20 years old, radiant, intelligent, and already being hailed as one of the most breathtaking young actresses Britain had ever produced. Critics admired her talent. Audiences adored her beauty. Hollywood was already watching. And from the moment Stewart saw her, something shifted. Not gradually, not cautiously, instantly. Years later, he would describe the feeling as overwhelming, almost disorienting. The kind of attraction that doesn't politely enter your life, it crashes through the front door and rearranges everything inside. There was just one problem. Actually, there were several. Stewart was 16 years older than Jean. He was married. He had children. He already possessed the life that many men spent decades trying to build. But desire rarely asks permission from responsibility. Instead of resisting it, Granger moved toward it, openly, fearlessly, perhaps recklessly. The British press followed every development with barely concealed delight. Scandal sold newspapers, and this was exactly the kind of story the public couldn't stop reading. Britain's handsome leading man had fallen deeply in love with a woman young enough to be his daughter, while his marriage quietly collapsed in the background. To many observers, it looked selfish. To others, it looked romantic. To Granger, it simply felt inevitable. By 1950, his marriage to Elizabeth March was over, and he married Jean Simmons. Together, they seemed almost unreal. Two beautiful stars standing at the beginning of what appeared to be a perfect Hollywood fairy tale. The cameras loved them. The public adored them. The future belonged to them, or so it seemed. Because hidden behind the glamour was a truth that would follow Stewart Granger for the rest of his life. The same intensity that made him irresistible also made him dangerous to himself, to his relationships, and to the people he loved most. And before long, that intensity would collide with one of the most powerful and feared men in Hollywood. A billionaire who was accustomed to getting everything he wanted, including Stewart Granger's wife. The billionaire, the battle, and the road to immortality. For most men, marrying the love of their life would have been the beginning of a happy chapter. For Stewart Granger and Jean Simmons, it was the beginning of a war. And the man standing on the other side wasn't just powerful. He was Howard Hughes. In 1950, Hughes was one of the richest and most influential figures in Hollywood. He owned studios, controlled careers, and operated with the confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. When he saw Jean Simmons on screen, he became determined to bring her under his control. Officially, it was business. Unofficially, many people believed it was something far more personal. Contracts became weapons. Projects were delayed. Opportunities disappeared. The pressure mounted from every direction. For a young actress trying to build a career, it was intimidating. For Stewart Granger, it was infuriating. He was many things: stubborn, impulsive, occasionally difficult, but he was never a man who backed down from a fight. The conflict dragged on for months. Lawyers became involved. Studio executives maneuvered behind closed doors. Hollywood's polished surface began revealing something darker underneath a world where power often mattered more than talent, and influence could shape destinies with a single phone call. Years later, Granger would still speak about Hughes with barely concealed anger. The battle eventually ended. Jean Simmons won her freedom. But the experience taught Stewart a lesson he would never forget. Hollywood wasn't a dream factory. It was a battlefield. And if you wanted to survive, you had to be willing to fight. Ironically, it was during this turbulent period that fate handed him the opportunity that would change everything. MGM had been watching. The studio understood something that even Granger himself may not have fully realized. He wasn't simply handsome. He wasn't merely charismatic. He possessed something rarer: presence. The ability to make audiences believe that danger was real, that adventure was possible, and that he belonged at the center of every story he entered. Soon, MGM would cast him in a role that seemed almost tailor-made for the man he had become. A fearless explorer, a man confronting the unknown, a man moving through hostile terrain with absolute confidence. The role was Alan Quatermain, And with it, Stewart Granger was about to stop being a rising star. He was about to become a legend. The King of Adventure. The transformation happened thousands of miles away from Hollywood. Not inside a soundstage, not beneath carefully controlled studio lights, but in the wild heart of Africa. When MGM cast Stewart Granger as Alan Quatermain in King Solomon's Mines, few could have predicted what would happen next. The production was unlike anything Hollywood had attempted before. Instead of building jungles on studio lots, the filmmakers traveled directly into Africa through Kenya, Uganda, and the Belgian Congo. The conditions were brutal. Scorching heat, dangerous terrain, unpredictable wildlife. Every day felt less like making a movie and more like surviving an expedition. Yet while others struggled, Stewart Granger seemed to come alive. For years, audiences had watched him portray courageous men. Now, for the first time, he was living the experience himself. The distance between actor and character began to disappear. Standing beneath the African sun, surrounded by landscapes so vast, they seemed untouched by time. Granger wasn't pretending to be an adventurer. He became one. There was something almost symbolic about it. The restless young man who had spent his entire life searching for a larger horizon had finally found one. And audiences could feel it. When King Solomon's Mines premiered in 1950, it became an international sensation. The film earned Academy Awards, captivated moviegoers around the world, and transformed Stewart Granger into one of MGM's most valuable stars. But the success went deeper than box office numbers. The public no longer saw Stewart Granger, the actor. They saw Alan Quatermain, fearless, resourceful, unshakable. The kind of man who could walk into danger and somehow emerge stronger than before. Hollywood had created many stars. Very few became myths. Then came Scaramouche. And if King Solomon's Mines made him famous, Scaramouche made him unforgettable. The film's legendary sword fight stretched for nearly 7 minutes, a breathtaking display of athleticism and precision. Granger trained relentlessly, performing much of the demanding action himself. There were no digital effects, no shortcuts, no safety net, only skill, commitment, and absolute confidence. By the early 1950s, Stewart Granger stood at the very top of the world. The money was flowing. The fan mail arrived by the thousands. Every new film reinforced the same message: he was one of the biggest stars on the planet. From the outside, it looked like the perfect life. But perfection is often the most dangerous illusion of all. Because while Stewart Granger was conquering Hollywood, cracks were quietly beginning to form in the life waiting for him at home. The cracks behind the spotlight. From the outside, Stewart Granger appeared to be living the dream. He had everything Hollywood promised: fame, wealth, admiration. And beside him stood Gene Simmons, one of the most beautiful women in the world. But the strange thing about success is that it often hides problems better than failure ever can. The bigger the spotlight becomes, the easier it is to miss the shadows gathering behind it. By the late 1950s, those shadows were impossible to ignore. The marriage that had once seemed like a fairy tale was beginning to fracture. Not because the love had vanished, but because love alone is rarely enough. Stewart Granger was a man of enormous intensity. The same confidence that made him magnetic on screen could become overwhelming in private life. He had a fierce temper, strong opinions, and a stubbornness that turned ordinary disagreements into exhausting battles. He wanted control. He wanted certainty. He wanted things done his way. Gene Simmons was different. Quietly strong, independent, ambitious. She was building a remarkable career of her own and had little interest in living permanently in someone else's shadow. Over time, those differences became fault lines. Arguments became more frequent. Distance slowly replaced intimacy, and the glamorous image the public adored began to drift further and further from reality. Then came the realization neither of them could avoid. They were no longer fighting for the marriage. They were fighting against its inevitable end. In 1960, after years of strain, the relationship collapsed. The divorce became official. For the public, it was another Hollywood breakup. For Stewart Granger, it was something far more personal. Years later, he would speak about the marriage with a level of honesty rarely seen among stars of his generation. He didn't blame Joan. He didn't portray himself as a victim. Instead, he admitted something far more painful. He knew he had contributed to its destruction. And beneath the confidence that had carried him through every challenge of his career, there remained a regret he never seemed to fully escape. Because some losses don't announce themselves when they happen. Their true weight reveals itself years later. At first, Granger tried to move forward. New relationships followed. New marriages. Even a woman with the title of princess entered his life. But no matter how many new chapters began, something from the previous one seemed to linger. And while his personal life grew increasingly complicated, another crisis was quietly approaching. This time, it wasn't his marriage that was in danger. It was his career. The Hollywood that had made Stewart Granger a star was changing. And for the first time in his life, he was about to discover what happens when the world stops needing the hero it once celebrated. When Hollywood moved on. For years, Stewart Granger had lived with a simple assumption. The success would continue. The leading roles would keep coming. The audience would always be there. After all, how could they not? He had conquered Africa in King Solomon's mines. He had dazzled audiences in Scaramouche. He had become one of MGM's most reliable stars and one of the most recognizable faces in the world. But Hollywood has never been loyal. It is obsessed with one thing above all else: what comes next. By the early 1960s, the industry that had elevated Stewart Granger was transforming before his eyes. The old studio system was beginning to crumble. Television was pulling audiences away from movie theaters. Younger actors were arriving with a different style, less polished, less heroic, more emotionally raw. The world was changing. And suddenly, the kind of leading man Stewart Granger represented no longer felt essential. The transition didn't happen overnight. It rarely does. First came fewer major projects, then smaller productions, then roles that would have been unthinkable during his peak years. European westerns, adventure films with modest budgets, television appearances. The phone still rang, but the calls were different now. The uncomfortable truth facing Granger was the same truth that eventually confronts almost every star: fame is not a permanent address. It's a place you rent for a while, and eventually someone else moves in. What made the experience especially difficult was that Stewart remembered exactly what it felt like to stand at the top. He remembered the premieres, the fan mail, the certainty that every studio wanted him. Now he was watching younger faces receive the opportunities that once seemed destined for him. Yet perhaps the most painful change wasn't professional. It was financial. During the golden years, Granger had spent money the way many stars of the era did, as if success would last forever. Beautiful homes, expensive properties, a cattle ranch, international travel, multiple marriages and costly divorces. The lifestyle remained. The income did not. Slowly, the gap between image and reality began to widen. The public still remembered Stewart Granger as the fearless adventurer, the man who could conquer any challenge. But behind the scenes, he was navigating a very different battle. The battle against irrelevance. And unlike the villains he faced on screen, this was an enemy that couldn't be defeated with courage alone. Because for the first time in his life, Stewart Granger was being forced to confront a question that terrified countless aging stars. Who are you when the applause stops? The man in the mirror. Who are you when the applause stops? For most of his life, Stewart Granger never had to answer that question. The world answered it for him. He was the star, the adventurer, the leading man, the hero who always seemed larger than life. But by the late 1970s, the noise had faded. The premieres were gone. The headlines had moved on. And for the first time, Stewart Granger found himself alone with something he had spent decades outrunning: himself. In 1981, he published an autobiography with a curious title, Sparks Fly Upward. It wasn't the title of a man celebrating victory. It sounded more like the reflection of someone looking back through smoke. Many expected another glamorous Hollywood memoir filled with amusing stories and carefully polished memories. Instead, Granger offered something far rarer: honesty. Brutal honesty. Page after page, he dismantled the myth people had built around him. He admitted his temper, his jealousy, his stubbornness. He wrote openly about failed marriages and opportunities lost. He spoke candidly about Howard Hughes' studio executives and the ruthless machinery of Hollywood itself. But the most striking thing wasn't what he said about the industry. It was what he said about himself. There was no attempt to rewrite history, no effort to cast himself as a misunderstood victim. The older Stewart Granger seemed to understand something the younger man never had. Success can open doors, but it cannot teach you how to keep the people you love from walking out of them. As he revisited the great adventures of his life, another realization emerged between the lines. He had spent decades chasing excitement. New countries, new films, new romances, new beginnings. But permanence had always felt more difficult than movement. And now, with age replacing ambition, he was beginning to count the cost. The memoir received attention. Readers admired its candor. For a brief moment, Stewart Granger returned to the public conversation. Interviews followed, television appearances, retrospectives celebrating Hollywood's golden age. But fame once lost rarely returns for long. Soon the spotlight drifted away again. Yet something had changed. For the first time, Stewart Granger was no longer trying to be a legend. He was trying to understand the man behind the legend. And that journey would lead him into the quietest and perhaps most revealing chapter of his entire life. Because the years ahead would bring something far more difficult than fading fame. They would bring loneliness. The years no one talks about. Loneliness rarely arrives all at once. It settles in quietly. A missed phone call, an empty chair, a familiar face that is suddenly gone forever. By the 1980s, Stewart Granger had entered a chapter of life that Hollywood rarely puts on screen. Not the rise, not the glory, not even the fall, but what comes after. He spent his time between Spain and Los Angeles, two places that reflected different versions of the man he had become. Spain offered distance from Hollywood's relentless obsession with youth and relevance. There, he could ride horses, hunt, and disappear into a quieter rhythm of life. Los Angeles was different. It was a city filled with ghosts. Every street seemed to carry memories of a world that no longer existed. The studios were still standing, but the people who had filled them were disappearing. Friends had died. Colleagues had retired. Entire generations of stars had faded into history. Hollywood, as Granger understood better than most, has no choice but to keep moving forward. Nostalgia may sell magazines, but the industry itself survives by finding the next star, not remembering the last one. And Stewart knew it. Perhaps that was what made the silence harder to ignore. There were still moments of connection. He remained in contact with some of his children. Old friendships endured. Yet beneath the conversations and occasional public appearances, there lingered a sense of unfinished business. One person in particular never seemed far from his thoughts. Jean Simmons, the great love of his life, the woman he had once risked everything to be with. By now, she had built a new life, a successful career, and a future independent of the man who had once shared center stage with her. Yet whenever Granger spoke about Jean in interviews, something changed. The sharpness disappeared. The bravado softened. For a moment, the fearless adventurer seemed to become simply a man remembering what he had lost. Not because he blamed anyone, but because age has a way of revealing truths that youth is too busy to notice. Success fades, beauty fades, even fame eventually fades, but certain regrets remain astonishingly clear. And as the years passed, Stewart Granger began speaking less about movies and more about time itself, about how quickly it vanished, about the people who were no longer there, about the strange realization that the world you once ruled can continue quite comfortably without you. It was a sobering thought, and soon an even greater challenge was approaching. One that no charm, no talent, and no legendary career could overcome. His final battle had already begun. The final chapter. His final battle had already begun. By the early 1990s, Stewart Granger was facing something far more relentless than fading fame or advancing age. He was facing mortality. The diagnosis was prostate cancer. By then, he was in his late 70s, living mostly in Los Angeles, a city where he had once arrived as a conquering star, certain that the future belonged to him. Now the future was growing shorter. Granger was not entirely alone. A small circle of friends remained. Some former colleagues still checked in. His children were part of his life, though the years had left their marks, as years often do. Yet beneath it all was an awareness he never fully tried to hide. The life he had built had come with a price. For decades, he had chosen movement over stability, adventure over routine, intensity over patience. Those choices had given him experiences most people could only dream about, but they had also left gaps. Gaps that become easier to ignore when you're young and impossibly difficult to ignore when you're old. In his final interviews, there was a noticeable shift in tone. The sharp wit remained. The confidence remained. But there was also something else. Perspective. He spoke openly about mistakes, about women he had loved, about opportunities missed, about relationships that deserved more of him than he had been capable of giving at the time. Not with self-pity, not with bitterness, but with the clarity that often arrives when there is no longer any reason to pretend. On August 16, 1993, Stewart Granger died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 80 years old. The obituaries were respectful. They celebrated the adventures, the films, the charisma, the legendary sword fights, and the remarkable career that had carried him from Britain to the very top of Hollywood. But somehow those achievements felt incomplete as the story came to a close. Because Stewart Granger's life was never really about success, it was about something more complicated. The eternal struggle between the life we chase and the life we leave behind. And perhaps that is why decades later, one image remains more powerful than all the movie posters. Not Stewart Granger riding triumphantly across Africa, not Stewart Granger standing before cheering crowds, but Stewart Granger sitting alone at a restaurant table in Beverly Hills. Still elegant, still proud, still unmistakably himself. A man looking back on an extraordinary life and understanding at last exactly what it had cost. In the end, Stewart Granger's story was never really about Hollywood. It was about the choices that shape a life. He experienced more adventure, fame, and success than most people could ever imagine. Yet he discovered the same truth many of us eventually face: achievements can fill a career, but they cannot replace the people who matter most. The films remain. The legend remains. But behind the legend was a man who spent his final years reflecting not on what he had gained, but on what he had lost. And perhaps that is what makes Stewart Granger's story feel so timeless, so moving, and so deeply human.